There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannon. There are
Well, the next, thing that we're going to have here, this is also in solidarity with Labor History Month, because too often we forget that most of our veterans are working class people. They're the ones that they send to the slaughter. And as a young man growing up in a home where my father was raising 6 kids as a bartender and made just enough tips that he could feed all of us in a 2-bedroom house. And just as he was starting to kind of make it in this world, and this was the time, the good days, when we had Social Security, we had good unemployment, we had a number of wonderful services available to us. And but we still came from a very poor family. We were moving up to the big time. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and that's when I decided, I didn't see a future for myself. I didn't really have much of an education. I was a dropout out of high school. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, just like so many young people today who enter the service. And I've been reading a lot of books about guys coming back from Iraq, from the first Gulf War, and from this Gulf War. And each of them have similar stories. They didn't know where their future was. The military was offering them education and travel, as though that was going to be a fun time. And I too hear the same story over and over again. And how are we going to change that? How are we going to change this reason why people join the military and other rich people send us to go die and kill other poor people and working class people? One way is to try and look at how labor and unions and working class people around this country can stand up against the administrations and the rich in this country that send other people to war. And one way to do that is for unions and others to say, we're not going to participate in that. About 2 years ago, the AFL-CIO put out a resolution against the war in Iraq. And yet I don't see enough labor organizations going on strike against this war. We need to bring labor, we need working class people to move past their leadership and demand that we do a general strike. This would be something that could stop the war. Well, one of the things, we just had a labor arts festival here, which was in solidarity with veterans in some ways, because they wanted to hold it during the Veterans Weekend. Veterans Day weekend. And it gave us an opportunity to explore a little bit what Sean said about Armistice Day and what Grant said, so that we kind of put that message out there also, so that people understood that we as veterans want to see a peaceful world, we want to work towards that. So we had speakers, we had musicians, we had Ann Feeney here, who's an international labor singer. We had Mike Crenshaw, who was up at the Seattle protest, who was he's with Hungry Mob, and he did, for a lot of labor people who had never heard hip-hop before, they got a chance to hear some hip-hop. We had an art show with work from the WPA program, the Work Progress Administration's work that put artists to work all across this country doing murals. We had mural speakers, Hector Hernandez, who's a Mexican muralist who actually studied in the same schools of Diego Rivera and others, and who came here and spoke about how murals are part of a community and how cultural experience is a way in which people can express themselves. We had Isaka Shamsuddin, who's an African-American muralist, who was a part of SNCC, who was a part of the Black Power movement and was the bodyguard to Stokely Carmichael. And he continues to be a muralist, known here at Portland State for a mural that's up in the Smith Center here as you come in through the side door, go up along the wall there, and it's about Vanport. And Vanport was a story about the immigration of a lot of people here to work in the shipyards during World War II. First time a lot of women began to work, and African Americans and Latinos and others came here. And this was a part of the country that was fairly racist. This was the sort of the ideal home for the KKK. And yet these people came here to work. And as other people were sent to war, they began to build a community. And then a flood came. And he talked about that flood, which is a part of that painting. He talked about how they were putting out a ship a day for the war. And then he talked about how when the flood was going to come, that they got a warning. It reminded me so much of Katrina just recently. They got it for the African Americans. They got a warning slipped under their door. Don't leave. You'll be okay. Until the water started coming up and they were rushed and a lot of people were killed. He said it was genocide against poor working class people and against African Americans. That's a part of the history of Portland. It's a part of history in almost every town across America. And that's why we have to stand up as workers, as individuals, as people who've served in the military to say no more to war. And today we also have a show. Part of it is available in here. After this, you can go in here. The show will be up all day from till 5 o'clock, from now to 5 o'clock. You'll see some works from the Labor Arts Show, some works from veterans. Mike Hasty's work is up here. He's a great photographer, and he's going to give a talk around 1 o'clock to talk about his work and how it involves his protest. We also had a number of people that were part of this program that were supporting this, which was, we had 3 different plays that were going on that were supported this weekend in support of Veterans for Peace. One play was Private Wars by James McClure, which was being held at Blackfish Gallery. And this was on November 9th and 10th. And they wanted to say that they were in support of what we were doing here today, and they wanted to get that message out. Also, Sharing Secrets, Oregon Veterans Redeem the Memories of Darkness. Sean is a part of that play, and Ted, I believe, is a part of that play. And these are veterans who are telling their stories. Now that's going to be going on at 2 o'clock today at Art Repertory Theater, and the second stage at 1516 Southwest Alder. And its general admission is $19 and $10 for veterans. Then there's also another play called The Fall of '09. This is the Anishka dancers with I can't even say it, La Pleiades da Danza Contemporaries. And these are Mexican dancers who choreographed the dance, who came all the way up from Mexico to perform that dance over at the Imago Theater tonight. And all veterans are admitted free. This is the kind of support that people in the community are doing through the arts and through their own personal and private individual opposition to this war in support of Veterans for Peace. So please, come and join us, and let's put an end to war.
The one thing we can never forget is that it's not just the men and women in uniform that are killed and maimed, displaced, and affected by war. Civilians, women, children, aunts, uncles, you know who they are. Wars today are so industrial and so non-discriminate that the innocents die 10 to 100 times more than those in uniform. So we must remember them and the after effects such as Agent Orange, which affects hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese still. And we don't know yet what depleted uranium will do in the Gulf. But I would like to remind you of a folk singer, Phil Oakes, who said, "Do not expect a reward for your struggle. The struggle is your reward." So don't stop. And I'm going to leave you with He wasn't a veteran, but his father was. His father was a general, and he's passed on now, the singer that I'm going to put on here. It's a poem followed by a song I think we can all relate to. So, John Denver, whose father was General Dusseldorf.
There's a name for war and killing. There's a name for giving in when you know another answer. For me, the name is sin. But there's still time to turn around and make all hatred cease and give another name to living. We could call it peace. And peace would be the road we walk each step along the way. Peace would be the way we work, and peace the way we play. And in all we see that's different and all the things we know, peace would be the way we look. Peace the way we grow. There's a name for separation. There's a name for first and last when it's all of us or nothing. For me, the name is past. But there's still time to turn around, make all hatred cease, and give a name to all the future. We could call it peace. And if peace is what we pray for, and if peace is what we give, then peace will be the way we are, and peace the way we live. For there still is time to turn around and make all hatred cease, and give another name to living. We could call it peace. 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 Last night I had the strangest dream I've never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room, and the room was filled with men, and the paper they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when the paper was all signed, and a million copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads. Grateful prayers were prayed, and the people in the streets below were dancing round and round, and guns and swords
I think so. All right, Dan.
were scattered.
Well, I'm going to invite you all to come up close, and we're going to sit here and we're going to listen to a very important speaker, Mike Hasty, who's with Veterans for Peace, Chapter 72. Is a Vietnam veteran, 1970 to 1971, U.S. Army medic, photographer, and he'll speak about his photographs and how they inform his resistance and communication and his opposition to war. Mike, I'm not going to say any more because I know you can say more than I can about all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Appreciate everybody being here. A lot of people have heard me speak, and so it's under kind of a tendency, but I'm going to throw some different stuff in. I was, like I say, my name is Mike Hasty, and I was a medic in Vietnam. I got to Vietnam in September of 1970, and I left in September of 1971, so I was there a full year. I brought a about a dozen frames with photographs that were taken, most of them taken in Vietnam. There's some that were taken after the war. There's a couple of images that were taken when I went down to Crawford, Texas. When I went down there when Cindy Sheehan was in camp. It was after her son. Someone help me here.
Camp Casey?
Camp Casey, yeah. So anyway, I was down there about 4 days. I just took off and went. It was one of those things where if I had thought about it, I probably wouldn't have gone. I just went. There was a reason why I went, and I was able to get some pretty strong images when I was there. And also, it's the same thing when I went back to Washington, D.C. and photographed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and then I made another trip back to march on a really large anti-war rally that was there a couple of years ago. First time I went to D.C., I saw the wall in 86. So a lot of my images have to do with things that I experienced at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. If somebody were to ask me what is kind of my foundation about why I speak, why I do the things that I do, I would have to say that the reason I do what I do is because I cannot not do it. It's all about bearing witness. You have to. I think as veterans, as people who were veterans of of the Vietnam era, people that are the next generation, that came up after us, that were born, in the 70s, 80s, that are now experiencing their own Vietnam, because that's exactly what we're experiencing now in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also, hopefully, we won't be experiencing it in Iran, but I just don't know where this war is going. So it's all about bearing witness. It's all about telling the truth, so that we don't allow revisionists to and of course that's one of the things we're seeing is they're rewriting the history of the Vietnam War. I see it every day, and it's almost like when I talk to young people, they don't have any. They're like a clean slate. They don't have any knowledge of the Vietnam War. They don't have any knowledge of of what happened in the 60s, that powerful era. And I think that in order to understand what happened in the 60s, you almost have to have lived in the 50s to know the incredible contrast between the 50s and the 60s. I was born in June 20th of 1945. So I was born a couple of months before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's interesting, my father was a military officer, spent 20 years in the military, and we were in Japan and Germany. My family, my mother, and myself and my sister landed in Yokohama in November of 1947. We were the first American dependents to arrive in Japan after the war. Okay? And so my dad had already been there 6 months, and I heard a lot of the stories that my parents had to say. And my dad, I remember telling me a story where the Japanese were eating out of our trash cans, because that's the poverty that was going on during the occupation. And then I also experienced Germany in 50. We were there 53, 54, and 55. So I still had seen some of the bombed out buildings. And probably one of the more powerful experiences I had in Germany was when I was 9 years old, and this would have been 1954, and we went through the notorious concentration camp at Dachau. And so I saw the ovens and saw the mass graves, and that had a real powerful impact on me. And then, of course, my own experiences of being in Vietnam. So, kind of the theme of my photography is on card that I have that's on each picture, and feel free to take any of the cards that are on the photographs and also the small pictures that is on the counter in front of the picture, which is the Y helicopter I took in Vietnam. But the theme is basically that lying is the most powerful weapon in war. That's what, if anybody were to say, if I were to put all my photography in a book, I would probably call the book "Lying is the Most Powerful Weapon in War," and I would probably have the Y helicopter on the front of the book. You know. That picture was taken in 1970 in my unit, because toward the end of the war we were seeing a lot of we were starting to see the anti-war stuff, things that were written on helicopters and trucks and jeeps that were, by that time people were starting to figure out by 1970, that the war was a lie. And I got to Vietnam when heroin addiction was rampant. It was rampant in my unit, as it was throughout the Vietnam War. Toward the end of the war, a lot of people in my unit were addicted to heroin. And so I was seeing the rapid disintegration of American involvement in Vietnam. I was seeing the homicides and suicides, the rampant heroin addiction, and some of the racial stuff that was going on in my unit. So that's a big part of my story. We were getting some casualties in from the field. We'd get hit occasionally with a rocket or a mortar or a sapper attack. I was standing I was actually sitting on a bunker one time when a sniper round went over my head. And I was sitting up there with one of my best friends who was later killed in an auto accident 4 years after he came back from Vietnam. But we were just sitting on a bunker, just talking, and all of a sudden there's a zinging sound went over our heads. And you could hear the rifling of the bullet as when it went over our heads. So I've spent a great deal of time resurrecting the truth of the Vietnam War. And I think when you see American soldiers die, when you see a Vietnamese person die, there's something that happens into you, that you have to bear witness. You cannot let that historical evidence be buried. You just can't, especially with the subsequent wars that we've had after Vietnam. I mean, it's non-stop, as everybody in this room knows. What happened after Vietnam. We were moving into Angola, and then after that, it was we were experiencing the stuff that was going on in Iraq and Panama and on and on and on. So I think the United States since 1965 has probably sent military troops into or has bombed or sent missiles into about 25 countries since 1965. I added it up one time, did a list, and it was about 25 countries. So, and this information has to be resurrected, because young people nowadays have to realize that Vietnam is not something that happened 35 years ago. Vietnam is happening right now. And I think that's why it's so important for all veterans to resurrect Vietnam, or for the people that were in Panama, or for veterans that were in Lebanon when all those 360 some Marines were killed. I think it was in '82 when that happened. I met a vet that was in Grenada that was involved in that little skirmish, and I've met vets that were involved in Panama. And I've, of course, met many vets that have been involved in Iraq War I and Iraq War II, which is basically just one war. And so what I do is I resurrect the bad stuff. That's what I do. I've had many conversations with veterans that were involved in atrocities. Okay, and that's the stuff I continue to resurrect, is the atrocity stuff that happened. Because it's important that that people know this stuff, and I've heard a lot of atrocity stories in detail. Vets that were involved in, you know. I've talked to vets that were involved in giving that were giving information to pilots that were bombing civilian targets, and they were giving the coordinates over the radio and to the exact areas that were being bombed. And when they found out that the coordinates they were giving was civilian targets, 2 particular vets that I know of had a meltdown because of that knowledge. One vet was in Vietnam when it happened, and when he finally realized that he was giving that information to B-52 pilots that were bombing civilian targets, he walked into the orderly room after about 10 months in Vietnam, and he told his commanding officer that his tour of duty in Vietnam was over. Okay? He's one of my heroes, you know. And another one did the same thing, only he was in Thailand giving information to B-52 pilots as they were bombing civilian targets in Vietnam. Another veteran friend of mine was in the Marine Corps during the Tet Offensive, and he and a couple of squads walked into a Vietnamese village, and they rounded up the civilians who were in the village. There was about 50 of them. They gathered them up in a small area, and they murdered every single one of them. Another friend of mine walked into about 4 different villages that were bombed by American jets dropping napalm, and he walked into about 4 villages, and of the 4 villages there were about 200 innocent Vietnamese civilians that died as a result of those airstrikes. They were all civilians. They were all old people, women, children, and he gave a graphic detail of those. Of that incident when he walked into those villages and saw people that were scorched by the napalm. So those stories have to be constantly resurrected. They absolutely have to be, you know, because people need to know that in Vietnam we bombed everything in Vietnam. We fired artillery at everything in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. We dropped napalm on everything in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. We sprayed Agent Orange on everything. We defoliated an area that was equivalent to about 1/7 the land mass of what was then South Vietnam. And just Dan, who introduced me just earlier, went back to Vietnam recently and went to the Friendship Village in Hanoi and saw the continual generations of Vietnamese children who are affected by Agent Orange. And I saw some of the images that he took, and I've seen many, many images also that were taken. And I've known a lot of vets that went back to Vietnam who saw that. I saw a little bit of it when I went back to Vietnam in '94. I was seeing, some of the people that were deformed by the Agent Orange, and they were now adults. And then I was also seeing people that were, no arms, no legs, all that kind of stuff that you see when you go back to that kind of, when you go back to those places where the United States committed mass murder. And that's what we did in Vietnam. We committed mass murder. And we did it every day. We didn't do it every other day. We didn't do it twice a week. We didn't do it once a month. We did it every single day. The United States government committed atrocities in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It's just that simple. I don't mince any words anymore about it. And that information has to get out. You've got to, and that information has got to build. Because unless veterans bring out that information, then one more time we commit a conspiracy of silence, and then the up-and-coming veterans who go to Iraq or who go to wherever, they don't have knowledge of that information. And they absolutely have to have knowledge of that information. They just do. So I try to encourage veterans to bring out the war stories. To bring them out. I don't care how bad they are. Because it can save people's lives by giving that information out. It's like I had a friend of mine that was in World War II. It was on some of the some of the islands that they were fighting the Japanese. He says, we didn't take any prisoners. We shot every one of them. I have a friend of mine that was in Vietnam. When they interrogated people, they had them They had their hands tied behind their backs, and they had duct tape over their mouths. When they got through interrogating, they walked behind every one of those POWs with an M16 and shot them in the back of the head. That's what they did. So, this idea of the Geneva Convention rules are for fools. There aren't any Geneva Convention rules in Vietnam. It was a joke. And I think that, as hard as it is to hear some of this information, it's information that absolutely has to be resurrected. Because if we don't resurrect this information, then the next generation is lied to, thinking that there's some kind of glory in war. And so we have to, I often say the only glory in war is in the imagination of those who were never there. And so that's what I do. I'm committed to resurrecting the truth of the Vietnam War. No matter how painful it is, no matter who I have to talk to, no matter what venue I have to speak at, that information is imperative. And that's what I do. And sometimes I don't do it well. Other times I do it okay. There's been many times where I have not done well. And in my own life, there have been times where I've been, I was hospitalized twice for post-traumatic stress, one up in a hospital. One time I was on a padded cell. Like so many other people. My story is not unusual. It really isn't. It's not unusual at all. And there's a real positiveness to doing what I do. It's a real positiveness to what Grant does and what Harvey does and what Dan does. And, these people are frontline people. And I think one of the biggest resentments I probably have, if I have one, is that I really get tired of people who look at this war in Iraq and they abhor what's going on. They hate George Bush. They hate Dick Cheney and all the people that support this administration, but they don't take their anger to the streets. I get tired, and I'm sure Dan does, and I'm sure Grant does, I'm sure Harvey does, and many, many other veterans get tired of us always the ones that are doing it. It's like I have my own family. I'm considered the person who's the anti-war activist. And isn't it wonderful that they don't have to do that? Isn't it wonderful that they don't have to take their voices to the street? This is just what Mike Hastie has to do. It's just what Harvey has to do. It's just what Grant Rudy has to do. It's just what Dan Shea has to do. Thank you. And so I think that's the biggest thing. Is where are these people at? If we're going to have a major change in this country, people have got to take their voices to the street. And as long as they don't do that, like I was standing on a corner in Vancouver, Washington the other day. So it's a busy intersection over there off of Mill Plain, I think. I'm sure a lot of people have gone over there. And people were demonstrating there. It's an hour every Thursday, and it's in an intersection, a fairly large intersection, where thousands of cars will go through that intersection within an hour. And we're getting the thumbs up and people honking the horn, and there's about 8 or 10 of us there, and maybe there was about 12 or 14 later on in the day, but that's all. I want to ask you a question. Why wasn't there 1,000 people standing there? Why wasn't there 1,000 people? And I think, the reason I'm there is because I remember one time going into a tent in Vietnam, and a heroin addict took an M16, put it to his head, and he blew his brains out. I've gone into a Graves registration and unzipped a body bag where another soldier took a pistol and shot himself right in the head. Or you see an American soldier taken off of a helicopter and he's shot in the head. Or you see another American soldier taken off a helicopter and half his face is gone. That's why I do that. That's why Mike Hastie's pretty intense sometimes. And because I got to do it. Because I have a grandson. I have 3 great nephews. When people are at a funeral and they see their son or their daughter, in a casket who's been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, all of a sudden it gets very, very personal. And I think that's what is so important, because I know the faces of a lot of people in this audience, and I know all of you are connected to what I'm talking about. Even though you didn't have blood on your hands and brains in your lap, you don't have to. It's something that's deep inside of your subconscious mind. It's in your gut that this war in Iraq is immoral. It's immoral. The United States government has over 700 military installations around the world. And this war is about natural resources. It's about stealing natural resources in countries who cannot defend themselves, and then utilizing their people as a cheap labor force. That's what Vietnam was about. And it's just important that everybody carry that message. Whenever they speak, whenever they talk to people, And I've reached a point where now when I talk, I don't see it as depressing, because I think delivering the truth should not be depressing. I think as you do this more and more, I get up here and I stand up here and I don't bow my head. I don't, when I make critical statements, things that are really, toxic, if you will. I don't hang my head in shame, because what I'm doing is there is no rest for the messenger until the message has been delivered. That's what it's all about. I don't care whether it's me up here talking, or whether it's Dan Shea, whether it's Grant Remington or Harvey. It makes no difference. There is no rest for the messenger until the message has been delivered. And that's why I'm here. Because the message absolutely has to be delivered. So I can keep my 15-year-old grandson out of that casket. That's why I'm here. So when you do that, it's like Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he was a man that was in about 2 or 3 different concentration camps during the Second World War. He saw the worst of the worst. And he made a statement in that book, which I really cling to every day of my life, when he said that suffering ceases to be suffering when it has meaning. That's when I can carry a message that I think will help somebody else, whether it's going into the high schools, whether it's speaking here today, or any other venue. If I can deliver some information that will give somebody insight about what's going on, that maybe some information might be something they will pass on to maybe one of their siblings, which will keep them from going in the military, then my suffering has meaning. That's what it's all about. I get energized from that boomerang effect, where it always comes back to you when you tell the truth, And so, and I've seen it happen many times. I cannot tell you how many high schools I've spoken at, and because basically I go into high schools and I do a scared straight on these kids. Because if you don't get visceral with the kids at the high school, they fall asleep. They just do. They nod off, or they start writing letters, or they, just on and on and on. So if you don't crank it up a notch, if you don't get visceral, if you don't get personal, a lot of them just kind of drift off. And I can tell you how many times I've spoken to high school students where they come up to you and they grab your hand and they say, "Thank you." Or somebody comes up and says, "I don't think I'm going to go in the military." You have to ask yourself, how much is that worth to you? How much is that worth to you when a teenager comes up to you and says, "I don't think I'm going to go in the military after hearing what you said today"? What's that worth to you? Maybe I prevented a kid from being traumatized in a war. And then, whenever any vet who gets traumatized in a war, how many other people are affected by their traumatization? How many? Their children, their wives, their parents, their great-great-grandchildren can be damaged by that experience. I was raised by, like I say, a combat veteran. My dad's post-traumatic stress from North Africa. when he was there as a second lieutenant, traumatized me when I was growing up. A lot. Because my dad killed people in combat. And my home was not a safe place to be when I was growing up. I experienced PTSD at a very, very young age. You know, I mean, I was a thumb sucker and a bedwetter until I was 13 years old. That's the kind of stress that I carried inside of me because of my dad's war experience. And so it's absolutely, it's so important that vets get up here and they talk about this stuff. You know, because as I mentioned earlier, I had a close friend of mine that committed suicide as a result of being in Vietnam. His name was Sean Daly. And then I had another friend of mine that died in a head-on car collision 4 years after he came back from Vietnam. He was depressed. His mother told me he was depressed. I had another black medic friend of mine, Charlotte, North Carolina, who died on the streets of North Carolina. Died on the streets of Charlotte. And his mother, it's interesting, his mother said he changed his name. Willie's name was Willie. It's a black medic. His name was Willie C. Hemphill. And Willie got involved in the Black Brothers United in Vietnam, which is a really strong organization of black soldiers. And I think Willie didn't like his slave name. And when he came back from Vietnam, he changed his name. And I have a feeling that's why he did that. You've been extended 90 days, you know? And I can't imagine what that would have happened if I had come back from Vietnam after a year and then them saying to me, you got to go back. I'm thinking to myself, I can't go back. If I'd had to spend 2 tours in Vietnam, I probably wouldn't be standing here, as I think maybe a lot of other vets would be. I just cannot believe the trauma that these guys are going through with their military services in Iraq or Afghanistan being extended, you know, or having to spend 3 and 4 tours. I cannot even fathom what that's going to be like for these guys later on and after they've been back and after they get out of the military. You know, I had a friend of mine that was in Vietnam in '69, was in Da Nang, Marine. He got back from Vietnam and he didn't want to have anything to do with the military, but for some reason, 10 years later, 15 years later, he decided to go in the National Guard. And I don't know why he decided to do that, but he just did. He was actually kind of a father figure to a lot of the people that were in his unit here in Oregon. He spent a year in Afghanistan. And I heard him speak about a few months ago after he came back. I don't even, you know, I just can't imagine. Here's a guy that's been, here it is, he was in Vietnam in the late 60s, and all of a sudden, fast forward, and he's in Afghanistan in 2007. Can you believe that? So, I don't know how much time we need.
Sure.
Am I okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, it's so important. I've just reached a stage in my life where talking about this stuff and resurrecting this history, it's saving people's lives. I've heard the 3 veterans that are over here, you know, Dan and Grant Remington and Harvey, I've heard all of these men speak, and I know they carry a powerful message that helps save people's lives. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. And you know, some people are just chosen to bear witness. And I think that's why it's so powerful. When I hear a vet talk, and I've heard many, many, many Vietnam veterans speak about their experiences and how it's affected the audience. And it's like, it's just incredible when you have that gift of delivering a message that can save another person's life. So at this point, I'm not as depressed about Vietnam as I used to be. I'm really not, because I realize the power that veterans can have behind the microphone or being involved in anti-war activities. I want to tell a story that happened to me when I went up to Seattle a couple of weeks ago when they had that anti-war rally up there. This was very instrumental for me because I saw myself. Because I've been involved in a lot of anti-war rallies where I've gotten I've gotten very confrontational with people. It happened to me in Crawford, Texas. It happened to me in Washington, D.C., and it's happened in numerous marches here in Portland. And I'm sure, I'm sure a lot of you people have seen me express those opinions. And a lot of times it happens as a PTSD experience. It's just like all of a sudden somebody says something, they say the wrong thing, and all of a sudden I'm in their face. Or if I'm not in their face, I'm spewing information. I'm just spewing it out. This is what happened at this parade. The march was coming. By that time we were downtown Seattle. I was in the very front of the march, photographing the march as it was coming at me. I had a wide-angle lens on. I'd sit, sometimes I'd get down on the pavement and photograph, as the people were coming right at me. Of course, I have to get up real quick, make sure they don't run over me. The Iraqi Veterans Against the War were on the right side, okay? And the VFP guys, Harvey was there. They were more in the center, kind of back a little ways. But here's these guys, these Iraqi Veterans Against the War. These guys that are dressed in their camouflage fatigues, a lot of them. And off to the right, far right, was some pro-war people. And they were spewing their stuff. Okay? They were spewing their stuff with these Iraqi Veterans Against the War guys who were hot. They're still hot from their combat experience. And they said some things that disturbed one Iraq vet so bad. He had a megaphone in his hand, and he was all of a sudden, because he finally stopped and went over to speak to him to say something about what his experiences were in Iraq that would completely conflict with what they were saying. And then he got back in the formation, we were marching, and all of a sudden he lost it. He went off. He took the megaphone to his mouth, and he started calling them son of a bitches, you goddamn bastards, and on and on and on. And all of a sudden, I saw myself. He was traumatized. This Iraq vet was traumatized by those pro-war people. And that really had a deep impact on me. And it's all of a sudden I saw myself in this Iraq vet. Because I've been traumatized many times by pro-war people, who don't know shit about war. Us veterans have forgotten more about the reality of war than these people will ever know. Because what most of these people know about war, you could stick in a thimble. So when this Iraq vet went off, he was so, it's a wonder he didn't launch himself on these people. There was a lot of us that kind of gathered around him. I put my arm around him to kind of calm him down. But he was in a rage. And that was me. In fact, I went over to one of the guys and I confronted him. Young kid, I forget what they were calling, they were referring to us as whiners. One guy had a sign that said, oh God, what did he say?
Go to Canada.
Yeah, that's right, go to Canada, something like that. And all of a sudden, I had a visceral reaction in my gut. All of a sudden, I just wanted to launch on them. And that scares me because I'm capable of doing that. I really am. I'm capable of putting my hands around somebody's throat. And when all that anger comes out of me, nobody's going to stop me. I could take on someone who's three times larger than me and 25 or 30 years younger than me. And if I launch that energy on them, I hope there are other Vietnam vets there to stop me. So I've been able to stop myself. I got involved in a guy one time, Grant was there in front of the recruitment station when this pro-war guy was down there giving all of the people a lot of guff about being down there. He was portraying himself as a veteran and I was talking to different people who said week after week he shows up and he just makes it miserable for all the people that are demonstrating in front of the recruitment center. So I went down there one day, and I went nose to nose with this guy. I was absolutely fearless. When I got so close to this guy's face that he told me I had bad breath. That's how close. Because I realized that there were 58,000 dead Americans inside of me that was going one-on-one with this guy. It wasn't just my case. It was 58,000 dead Americans. And another 50,000 have committed suicide. Another 40,000 have died from Agent Orange exposure. All of those people were inside of me when I went one-on-one with this guy. And you know he never came back. Or if he did, he quit coming to them. He quit coming. If I understand right. Yeah. And that's like, that's what I had to do. That's what I had to do. I didn't put my hands around his throat. You know, I didn't do that. I was able to refrain from doing that. But I had to draw a line in the sand. I think you reach a point where you have to draw a line in your sand. You say, I'm not backing up anymore. This is who I am, and this is what I stand for, and you're not going to do this to me. You will not traumatize me anymore. You know, and that's the thing that I had to do, as so many other veterans in this room had to do. I remember one time I heard a guy speak. His name was Gershman Kaufman, and he was an authority on shame. Okay, did a lot of research on shame. And I was raised in a shame-based family. You know, a lot of people were. My dad was alcoholic, later got into prescription medication, and had a lot. He had massive PTSD, but back in the 50s and 60s, they didn't know how to treat it. You know, they didn't even have a diagnosis for the W2 vets. You know, but what was I talking about?
Shame.
Shame. Thanks. I finally realized something, and I couldn't understand it, that there's a close correlation between shame and rage. It's linked. And the reason why it's linked, as a Vietnam veteran, I carry a lot of shame for what my government did in Southeast Asia. When I went back to Vietnam in '94, was there 3 weeks and came back, I had a meltdown. I developed an anxiety panic disorder when I was being hospitalized again. And for 5 years, I had anxiety panic attacks. Okay? And during that time, there was times when I raged on some people, some pro-war people. And I finally realized through Gershman Kaufman that if you're shame-based, as a vet, let's say, if you're shame-based, that what you do to keep from being shamed again, you rage on people. It's a protective mechanism to keep you from being shamed again. So that's why a lot of vets, like myself, will launch or will defend himself in front of people like the pro-war people. I did it when I went back to D.C. 2 years ago. I confronted about 7 or 8 guys. One-on-one, just me, 7, 8 guys. I drew a line in the sand. And finally, Edmund, for the police officer who broke it up, he said, you got to go on, you got to move on. Usually they always give you a little bit of grace period, especially if you're wearing a jacket. You know, I usually wear my Vietnam thing. And I've come close to being arrested probably many times. But the cops will always come up to me and they'll say, okay. I always love it when they do this. They say, okay, one more time, and I got to arrest you. And then I go, okay, I'm done. And so the cops always give you a little latitude. So there's one advantage of being a vet with a jacket on. A lot of times the cops will give you one more time, and they'll say, I'm going to have to arrest you. Or they get the cuffs out, and you say, okay, I'm done. I won't do it anymore. And I'm a person that doesn't get in cops' faces. I don't give shit to people who have a gun. I just don't do that. That's just common sense for me. So I usually don't have any trouble. A lot of times when I confront cops, I just tell them who I am, why I'm here, and I tell them why. I try to tell them what we did in Vietnam, and that it's important that they know so they don't think we're a bunch of kooks. And I've done that many times where I give a little 5-minute, dialogue with, could be 8 or 10 cops, and I'll just tell them. And I'm very kind to them. I'm very, I don't, like I say, I don't go after them. I just tell them why I'm here. And I think a lot of them go, oh, okay. Because I can see it in their faces when you deliver the truth and tell them why you're there. Because basically that's what you do. You have to give them information that they don't know. And I think sometimes when you give people information, first-hand information, people go, oh, now I understand. It does help, and I think that's the greatest thing that vets can do. It's just simply bear witness and tell them what you experienced. And so, I've seen it. Virtually every vet I know has done that. So, I don't know what else I could talk about. There's one thing I will. I could go on, as many of you already know, but there's a picture here that I want to show you, and there's something written under it that's really important. It's the one thing that saved me in 1977 when nobody was talking about Vietnam. Virtually nobody was. I think the first book that came out about Vietnam was probably but it could have been in the late 70s. I think The Rumor of War was one of the very first books that came out about Vietnam. But let me just read you something that, for me, was a lifesaver. At the top is a medic friend of mine, and I caught him in a pensive mood where he was just depressed. Okay, his name was Edward Tinberg. He was from Kansas. And then under it is a cemetery in Oklahoma. And it was a military cemetery. And the headstone that's right here in the foreground, the man's name was Thomas Michael Clausen. And he was a corporal, U.S. Marine Corps, Vietnam. He was born in 1955. And he died in 1989. And I wonder, what did he die of? Did he take his own life? He wasn't that old, like so many other Vietnam vets have. So I photographed it because basically what it was, I was attending a funeral of my uncle, who was a World War II veteran and a Korean War veteran. And I saw this image. And I just, like so many times when I carry a camera, I just take it. I just take the image, not knowing when I'll use it or how I'll use it. I just take the image. Okay. Under this thing, I got a quote from a book called The Survivor by Terence Dupree. Okay. Basically, it was a book about the concentration camps during World War II and why it was so difficult for concentration camp survivors to bear witness after their experiences in the death camps. Why a lot of people just wanted to put that behind them. We don't want to talk about that stuff. And that happened with so many, many Holocaust survivors. Listen to these words, because they really are profound. And when I bought this book, I dated the book 1977, or I think that's when I bought it. Terence Dupree says, "The survivor, then, is a disturber of the peace. He is a runner of the blockade men erect against knowledge of unspeakable things. About these he aims to speak, and in so doing he undermines, without intending to, the validity of existing norms. He is a genuine transgressor, and here he is made to feel real guilt. The world to which he appeals does not admit him, And since he has looked to this world as the source of moral order, he begins to doubt himself. And that is not the end, for now his guilt or shame is doubled by betrayal of himself, of his task, of his vow to the dead. The final guilt is not to bear witness. The survivor's worst torment is not to be able to speak. That's it. That's what happens to a lot of us vets when we come back and we try to bear witness. And nobody believes it. They think you're crazy. Or they think this or they think that or whatever other think they think. They cannot deal with the shame of what their government did in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. That's why people like me and people like Harvey and Grant and Dan are threats to the norms of society. That's why. I think I'm just going to end with that. I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a great feeling to be in the presence of so many wonderful people. So thank you.
That's what I'm talking about. That's when we start talking about veterans. I was thinking about Mike talking about the idea that we're bearing witness, and that when he's doing his artwork, it's because he has to. What else is he going to do? People ask me same kind of things that I've listened to other artists talk about. Why did you become an artist? It wasn't something that we made money at. It wasn't something. Some people do make money at it as an artist. It's kind of a thing in which it's a bit of luck. It's a bit of who you know. It's a bit of getting into a sort of social clique within the gallery systems. You become stable. It's kind of like slavery in a sense when they say you're part of a stable in a gallery, and then you're contracted with them to produce a certain kind of work. And then when you get into a production mode of something, it gears your mind in a different direction. But for me, I always liked to draw. I always liked to deal with images that I would see. But when I came back from Vietnam, it wasn't about art in that sense for me. It was about I had to exercise these demons that were in my mind. I had to exercise a sort of control over my environment, a control over the language, the communication that was being put out there by the media. That was always saying we had to support the status quo, that we had to support this great America. And something inside me was kept saying, that's not the Vietnam that I remember. That's not the kind of war that was happening over there, And I wasn't in Vietnam more than 3 months. It doesn't, for one person to live, it can be one day, the minute they set foot in there. But I was fortunate that, well, fortunate or unfortunate, I was fortunate that, I never had to fire my weapon while I was there. What I saw, we were fired upon by sniper fire. And when we went on operations, it was search and destroy. And when you talk about atrocities, this whole idea that we would even have this order to go in and shoot down anybody, man, woman, or child, that were in a certain section that you were going through and patrolling. And those are the atrocities that did happen by people that followed those orders. We happened to have an officer who did not follow those orders. And when we did see people, he refused to have us fire on those people. I was very fortunate. Unfortunate, fortunate. My brother was in the military at the same time that I was. And he had signed a waiver and came to Vietnam in the same company and platoon that I was. I was in the U.S. Marines. I was a machine gunner. I was always put out on point. And we were in Da Nang and in Phu Bai, Quang Tri area. So pretty close to the border, the DMZ. And I just come off an operation in which we had committed a mutiny out in the field, just basically because we were tired of humping the hills. We were tired of getting shot at in the middle of the night when we bunkered down. We were tired of rounds that came in and wounded a few of our people and found out it was friendly fire. We were tired because we ran out of food and we ran out of water. In fact, at one point I was going through heat exhaustion, and I took my machine gun and threw it down the hill. The lieutenant came back and he threw me down the hill with it. He said, pick it up. But I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what was happening to me, you know. I just had enough. I just had enough of doing this. But what it was a protest. It was a protest that we had people that were exhausted and couldn't go any further, and nobody was saying anything. And I didn't know how to say it any other way but just to get mad. And so, but at that moment, because that happened, they stopped everybody and we camped down. And then we were ordered to go again, and we were supposed to be going over to this village, and everybody says, no, we're not going. You know, we just don't have enough water, we don't have enough energy. We're in 110, 15, 20 degree heat in the middle of the jungle. And so they ordered this one sergeant, you know, sergeant obeys orders. He's an example for the rest of the men. And he went up this trail. It was the first guy I ever met when I was in Vietnam. And when he walked up that trail, all of a sudden there was an explosion. He had stepped on a mine and it killed him. So they had orders to continue to go forward. And we said, fuck you. Plain and simple. And they called in a colonel who flew in on a helicopter and gave us the same order. Everybody flipped him the bird. He goes, oh, I guess your morale's a little low here. He calls in chow and helicopters. He brings in hot food, beer, and guys are trading beer for people that didn't drink. We get a few more cans by trading our rations. And at the same time they're bringing this in, they're zipping up the body bag and taking out that sergeant who went up that hill and obeyed those orders. And it really struck me that, you know, you never know when you're going to go. You never know what's going to happen in this thing. And I wasn't really ever scared when I was there. Maybe it was just stupidity. Maybe it was just that you're in shock all the time. But as the next day we had to go into this village, search and destroy village. There were guys who were going down this hill, and we went down into this guys were walking on the dike, and I was in the rice paddies, and the guys who were on the dikes, more booby traps, more explosions, and people, I'd hear an explosion and somebody scream, and I didn't know whether they lost a leg or they were killed or what. And then the next moment we get into the village, one booby trap after another every 5 feet. And all I remember is hearing explosions and screams. And then it seemed to me, and this is what bothers me, what I remember is that there was nobody in the village. All these men had died on this mission. And these trucks pull up and pick us up and drive us about 5 miles back to where we were. And we've been out for a week or two in the jungle. And yet I don't know if that's the truth. I don't know if I blocked out what happened in that village. I say I never killed anybody. And it really, it frightens me to think that you could have killed somebody there. Sorry. Because your mind will do something to you. It will stop you from remembering what really happens. And I can't remember what happened after those people died. Those booby traps. And it still doesn't make sense to me. I've been spending the rest of my life trying to make sense of this. And war is just a horrible thing for anybody to have to experience. Excuse me. Shit. I didn't expect this. I'm sorry.
But that's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, these guys that are coming back. And each one of these guys are going to go through the same thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about how art is one way that we try to release these demons, and how in history, war has been a part of our history throughout centuries. And that we've got another vet here, Jack Dresser, who's a PhD Vietnam vet. He's with our Veterans for Peace group down in Eugene. And he's got a piece here that's going to deal about art and resistance. And we all know that great art piece by Picasso, Guernica, which was about another war. And I just want to, this is the beginning, we start to look at this work here. And part of it is talking about what I'm saying. Each of us are trying to express ourselves in a different way. And I want to invite Jack up here to take over from here, because I don't think I can say anything more. Thank you.
I was an Army psychologist stationed in Madigan Hospital during the Vietnam War. And I never identified with the military. I never identified with being a veteran until the last presidential campaign, and I found that that gave me credibility to be a veteran, to start going after this administration and going after the whole issue of war. And it wasn't just Vietnam. We've been at war. The CIA has been at war. We've been in a continuous state of war since World War II. Our whole economy is dependent on war. And so I'm asked from time to time, since I was an Army psychologist, to talk about PTSD. So I put together a PowerPoint. That's why I like to do presentations. And it got longer and longer, you know. So this one I have is pretty long, and it goes into a lot of things, because there's many, many effects of war, not just on the individual. And yeah, it incorporates some art, it incorporates photography, it incorporates text, it incorporates text from international law, it incorporates lots of dimensions of trying to communicate to people. But the great, you know, I was struck with the earlier speaker. He was saying, okay, there are 10 of us out there raising hell about this war, and where's the other 3 million people in Portland? Or 3 million in the greater metropolitan area? Where are they? How do you communicate to human beings who don't want to know? And so I've tried to find some ways of bridging the gap, of making people understand, and this is useful for counter recruitment and all kinds of things. I mean, one of the first things I say to high school kids then when I'm doing counter recruitment, you know, is how many people are you willing to kill for a college education? Are you willing to become a hitman for the United States government that operates pretty much like the mafia for a college education? Actually, you know, community college isn't that expensive. You might look at some alternatives. Let me get this. I think this thing has to warm up for a minute. So I've run along some. I'm interested in education. I'm interested in getting people to read. I'm interested in getting people to understand. Certainly narratives of Vietnam and the new Iraq War veterans can be very powerful in doing that. But we need to know, even beyond that, that this is what our country is about. That we are the only country that has invaded other countries and massacred people since World War II. We're the only country after Germany that's ever done that. Certainly at the scale we've done. I mean, Israel has also on a much smaller scale. And of course you have civil wars going on all over the place. As long as there's civil wars, they don't violate international law. So I'm trying to communicate to, let me people who have never had these experiences and don't want to have them and shouldn't have to have them and don't want to get close to it and don't want to be touched by it. I decided to try to communicate it through through talking about sex, because the state of mind that's involved in combat is an altered state, and the altered state that's most familiar to most people of adult age is sex, which is also an altered state. And it's interesting that this very good book that I recommend to everybody on killing by Colonel Dave Grossman, he utilizes exactly the same parallel. He says, very succinctly, he said, killing is to war as sex is to a relationship. In other words, it's the nuts and bolts. This is an optical scanner, so I should be able to... So I call war organized lethal violence. It takes a bit of the romance out of the image. I think words are very important. What you call something is very important. What I've always appreciated deeply about combat veterans is they absolutely speak the truth. They speak right from the gut, and they don't pull any punches because they don't need to, because they've been there and they're not afraid of anything else. They're certainly not afraid of public opinion. They're not afraid of offending people. So combat is an altered state, and it's very important to understand that human beings have a variety of states of mind that are available to us for whatever we're called upon to do. And as really a hunting animal, a predatory animal, I think that's where this capacity to become a psychopath, to become an animal without conscience for the purpose of one's own survival, is hardwired into the American brain. And most human beings, of course, never have to experience this, either vicariously, directly through direct vicarious experience or direct experience. And what we always see is this romanticization, this mythology around war, where the social group that benefits applauds and sanitizes the brutality, glamorizes the war, glamorizes the warrior, and we are trained to do this from an early age through the American media. We have the most violent entertainment industry anywhere in the world. It's starting with animated cartoons in very early life. If you've seen the International Animation Festival, we see cartoons around the rest of the world don't do that, except in Japan, imitating us. So this is this altered state of mind that is involved in the warrior. It's something that gets us put in jail in civilian life. So you are trained to become a killer. You're trained to become a criminal of the worst kind. The purpose of war is very simple: is to kill other human beings and to impose violent domination on another society. Pure and simple. If you don't want to do that, then don't join the military. And this goes back forever in human history. I mean, this is from the old Norsemen, the Vikings, the glamorization of the warrior. But this is an archetype that is very rich. It's not just killing. It involves power. Probably you've all seen Apocalypse Now. You remember, and the most noteworthy, memorable figure was the colonel, played by Robert Duvall, who says, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. And he represents this psychopathic warrior who who actually loves and worships death and violence and destruction. That's his high in life. And you know, the book that Apocalypse Now is based on, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, Conrad says that man has two great enterprises, to love and to kill. So sexuality and murder are probably the two most intense interpersonal experiences that human beings experience. This is a panel from the Bayeux Tapestry in Bayeux, France, which was the first town liberated when we stormed Omaha Beach. And it's 230 feet long, and it memorializes the Norman conquest, which were the Vikings invading France there. And so that's 878 years before we invaded Omaha Beach. This stuff's been going on a long time.
Jack, did you know that in the Bayou Tapestry underneath is Aesop's fables?
Oh, yeah.
And it was actually people that were conquered were writing an alternative history from the victim's point of view.
Right. Which does remain untranslated officially. And it's interesting, this is the entrance to Bayou, the statue of Eisenhower there at the entrance to the town. And it occurred to me that, you know, we thought at the end of World War II that we had, you know, conquered the demon. We had conquered evil in the world. This ancient archetypal force called evil. And I had read this fascinating thing that's written there about Carl Jung, who had identified what he called the rise of the blonde beast in the dreams of his German patients shortly after World War I. And he had Swiss and German patients, and he only identified these images in the dreams of his German patients. This is the American cemetery in Normandy. So I was reflecting, have we in fact inherited the spirit of the beast rather than conquered it? Because that seems to me to be the case. You know, in Normandy, they don't forget. They don't allow the citizens to forget war, and they're still extremely welcoming of Americans. They love Americans in Normandy. And they have never forgotten that we rescued them, and they have never removed these pillboxes and the German Panzer tanks as a continuous memory. And you never see anything like this in, you know, the Springfield Mall, you know. This is the ossuary at Verdun, France, a memorial to the victims of World War I along the Western Front. The German army crossed the Rhine and were headed for Paris. They were met there by the French army. They stayed there for 4 years and slaughtered each other, and none of them moved more than 50 yards one way or the other. There are 350,000 died in the first 9 months. This is the cemetery, and this ossuary behind it, if you don't know what an ossuary is, it's a repository of unidentified skeletal remains. It's 130,000 unidentified dead in this very, very austere, to me, very symbolic building. It looks a little bit like unexploded ordnance. It looks a little bit like a cross. And it's all in this dreary gunmetal kind of gray. So what we're dealing with, the 289,000 people who don't show up for the war rallies anti-war rallies are infected with the myth of war, the romance of war. And that's what you're running into. You come back home and you say, hey, it wasn't that way. Wait a second. We committed atrocities. That's what the Winter Soldier movement arose from. You know, after Seymour Hersh exposed the My Lai massacre and Calley was prosecuted for it, all these other Vietnam vets got together in Detroit, and there was about 150 of them, and they all shared stories. And they said, "Wait a second, this was American policy. We all did this. We all committed atrocities. We all massacred people." And that's what led to Kerry's famous speech before Senator Fulbright's Foreign Relations Committee. If he'd still been able to speak with that kind of force and resolution, he would be president today. He could have even beaten Diebold. This is the Zeppelinfeld. These are all my own photographs from my trips over there. This is the Zeppelinfeld, where Hitler did his monumental addresses, where we saw, tens of thousands of sheep-like Germans doing the Sieg Heil salute. And what's fascinating, inside that building now, it was all our bunkers in the back, it's all been turned into a museum that is an absolutely fearless and uninhibited review of themselves. Pictures of the Sieg Heil, pictures of the anti-Semitic posters, pictures of everything they did. They are not going to let their own people forget. It's all in German. It's not for the tourists. This was in one of the halls. This is what happens in war. We're all trained to dehumanize the other side. In this case, it was initially the dehumanization of the Jew. And of course, we dehumanize the Germans as Krauts, and we dehumanize the Japanese as Nips, and we're now dehumanizing Iraqis as Hajis and ragheads and sand niggers. And our troops are actually being trained in the use of these words and these classifications of other human beings in basic training. They were gooks in Vietnam. And always, of course, communists. Communists were replaced by terrorists. And we now have the media buying into this whole war on terrorism nonsense as if it actually exists. And there was an invention clear back in the 1980s to replace the Great War on Communism in order to keep the whole system going. This, of course, is the Guernica that Dan referred to. A scale copy of this hangs in the United Nations. And when Colin Powell went there to deliver his absolutely duplicitous address to the United Nations about the WMDs supposedly possessed by Saddam, they covered this up with a tarp. They didn't want to force him to walk in front of this. These are a famous, part of a long series of very famous paintings by Goya, The Disasters of War. And one of the things that's very interesting, it wasn't published till some 50 years after the war. This was painted during the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. And they weren't allowed to be published until 50 years later. And here's a really fascinating painting that Goya did, and he never explained it. And he painted it about the same time. But it's been interpreted by some, I tend to agree with this, as an image of the state devouring its own people. And those of you who are combat veterans from Vietnam and elsewhere, you felt devoured. You came back and you know what that feeling is. You were, and you're continuing to be devoured from inside. Oh, I should go back to that one. Oops, no, never mind. Previews, there we go. Yeah, this, of course, is a famous painting, The Scream, by Edvard Munch. And he had an image just walking across this bridge of this immense pain. And it reminds me a bit of a story that Dan told me about an epiphany of his. Right, Dan? Yeah. As if this is somehow at the center of the universe, or the center of human life. Now, this is something that's very interesting. This whole effort to communicate to people who have never been there and seen this and felt it and smelled it. Freud had this concept after World War I. He was puzzling because his whole theory was based on an awareness of the libido, of the life force, of the procreative force, of the drive for pleasure, and the vicissitudes that goes through during the course of human development. And after World War I, he could not account for the insanity of this war within his theory. And so he developed the idea that Eros was balanced by Thanatos, a built-in instinct for death and destruction. And Carl Jung, another early psychoanalyst, had some very interesting insights. He looked at Wotan, which is the image he saw in his patients after his German patients after World War I. The images of Wotan, the god of storm and frenzy, the god who informed the berserkers of Viking times. But he also indicated that he's a superlative magician, an artist in illusion. And in this other quote by Jung, he's questioning, why haven't people learned? And why don't people ever learn? And he blames the conscious mind rather than the unconscious. You see, he thought the unconscious has some sort of more instinctive sense. But it's through the manipulation of the conscious mind that we perpetrate these atrocities. By classifying people, what Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, called the invidious distinctions that people make by classifying one another into in-groups and out-groups. Our group is human, the other group isn't. It's like the other group becomes a different species that we can send to the slaughterhouse. And of course, Goering, the great propagandist of the Third Reich, understood this very well, as did the other propagandists of the Third Reich. And as did Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, who's the principal architect of the neoconservative movement that's brought about the current war. They just tell people anything and just manipulate them and scare the hell out of them. Tell them they're being attacked and they're under threat continuously. And the threat, in this case, the threat is invisible. It could be all around us. It could be anywhere. It can't be pinned down. It can't be identified. And so let's build more and more weapons and kill more and more people. This is something that's very timely. I decided to put in this presentation, and then we just had a Attorney General confirmed who was unable to say that waterboarding was torture. Well, waterboarding goes back to Vietnam, and maybe before. It actually goes back to the Spanish Inquisition. Around 1500 is when it was first identified. Been doing it a long time, trying to, drowning people right up to the point of death. One of my friends in Eugene participated in Vietnam in 2 incidences of waterboarding, and he just described it to me in a TV interview, and we put it up on YouTube. This was actually published in the Washington Post in 1968. And it has been defined as torture by every Judge Advocate General of all the American Armed Services. So here we are again in Iraq, back in the same suit again. Some images from Iraq. And these are the visible wounds, you see. And I'm going to get to the invisible wounds later. The visible wounds, I think, inspire more sympathy. They shock people, they alarm people, they inspire the sympathy of people, they get you VA benefits more easily than the invisible ones. And the invisible ones include survivors, they include all those who are grieving for the loss. They include the victims of our wars. This is an incident that was, I think, Dan, you have a picture on your business card from the same incident where there's a family driving along in Tel Afar, Iraq, and the parents were blown away in the front seat, and they had 5 children in the back seat at a U.S. checkpoint at night. I have these pictures all over my van. I have them laminated and mounted on magnetic sheets. My whole van is covered with these kind of pictures that generate a lot of conversations everywhere I go. This is the first one I ever held up at an anti-war rally, and in fact it was on Portland television, and somebody asked me to say something about it, and I said, I can't imagine any American citizen looking at these faces and ever looking at the face of George Bush again without absolute contempt. And that one, of course, struck me as a father of 5 children. I mean, I can really feel myself with this man. The one on the lower right I have on my van next to the American pregnant wife looking in the casket. So it is not only the victim who suffers, and I'm going to get into this now from this point on, it is not only the immediate victim who suffers from this kind of violence. And this violence includes the use of 5 different internationally prohibited weapons by the U.S. military right now. There are two criteria for defining a weapon as illegal. One is that it's unnecessarily cruel, and the other is that it is indiscriminate. You cannot discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Of course, in Iraq, there should be no such thing as a combatant, because everybody there has the legal right to defend their own country and to shoot at us. And we have no right to be there. We have no right to inflict a single death or injury on any Iraqi citizen, combatant or otherwise. Many of these things you will remember are also used clear back in Vietnam, and it was a result of Vietnam that some of them were declared illegal weapons, like napalm. So it's people who see the results of violence, who witness violence, who are also affected for the rest of their lives. Will these men ever forget this? This is a victim of our use of white phosphorus, which is another prohibited weapon, which simply melts human flesh. It's permissible in war to use it as a battlefield illuminator. It's not legal to shoot it at people because it is absolutely ghastly in its consequences. Now, can you imagine this as your son or your father or your brother or your best friend or your husband looking at that in a casket? And what are you going to think of the Holy Roman United States Empire? These are Iraqi children with birth defects resulting from depleted uranium exposure during the Gulf War, which of course is the Agent Orange of this generation, which with much longer lasting effects than Agent Orange, and that that depleted uranium has a half-life of over 4 billion years. So we have made this entire area of the world completely uninhabitable forever. Of course, these are the pictures you've seen of torture. Now, what is going to be the effects of the people committing the torturing, as well as the victims? It's not just, the girl up there in the center who's in jail right now. It's everybody else who's participating in it. They're going to have those memories. Just like the guys doing the waterboarding in Vietnam. These are statements from returning Iraq vets that were reported by the Guardian. Used to be known as the Manchester Guardian, the London newspaper. They were all headed down to help with Katrina, and they saw this news crew from England, and they just ran up to them. They wanted to tell their story. They wanted to say something. Wanted to get it out to the public. Trauma victims who don't talk about it are the ones who end up killing themselves. So how likely are these, you spoke earlier about the Iraq war vets and how likely it is that they're going to be suffering from these same kind of things. And you can see what the frequency of these experiences are for each of them. Seeing dead bodies of human remains, almost everybody, almost 100%. Handling or uncovering these remains, about half. Of course, being involved in some kind of direct combat is up there over 90%. And as you say, they're going back over and over and over for repeated tours of duty. And these are some of the realities of modern warfare. Some of these facts are from another very important book by Chris Hedges, called What Every Person Should Know About War. It's just a very simple format, a Q&A format, very straightforward, factual answers. The greatest counter-recruiting tool you'll find. Now this 2% of the population as natural killers, these are psychopaths who spend most of their lives in prison, in civilian life. And this book by Colonel Grossman describes how it was discovered that most people, even in the heat of combat in World War II, didn't ever fire their weapons. And so the Army set about to figure out how to train people, convert them from being normal human beings into being killers in combat situations. And the basic training structures have been organized around these principles. Ever since, they're getting better and better at it. So the obvious consequences of culture, we have culture is more than society. It involves the mythology and the collective self-image of our nation and the behavior that comes out of that. So getting to the individual, psychological trauma is fairly simply defined. It is emotion which is intolerable and unmanageable, which results from extreme experiences, and for which we lack the ego defenses, as it's called in psychoanalysis, the ego defenses to comprehend, to assimilate, to digest. And so these memories remain undigestible and undigested throughout the rest of life. This is what causes flashbacks, nightmares, and in some cases the kind of complete repression which Dan is afraid may have happened to him. But they always produce symptoms. This is the study that was done by a colonel in World War, or a brigadier general in World War II. What I just described about the 2%. Now the autonomic reactivity, this is your heart rate, your whole stress response. And as I said in the earlier slide, there's a threshold at which emotional stimulation, emotional arousal becomes intolerable, unassimilable. And there's a certain range at which we like stimulation. And it doesn't matter whether it's fear, anger, whatever. We like a little bit. Some of us like to argue. We like a little bit of combat. We like a little bit of friction. We like a little bit of fear. I mean, that's the secret of roller coasters and horror movies. You like to be a little bit afraid. It's stimulating. You get too far below that, it's boring. So there's an optimal level of arousal that we like. It gets a little too high and it starts getting painful. That's when we want to kind of lower that level. But what if you can't lower it? And in fact, gets higher and higher. That's what happens in combat. These are circumstances that are out of your control. You can't withdraw from them. You can't escape from them. And they can be quite prolonged. And, Dan said 3 months was about all, he was ready to get out of there long before that even. And now we're looking at these guys being deployed over and over and over again back to Iraq. So these are some of the initial responses to traumatic stress. And due to some of these initial responses, many people carry a lot of shame because they didn't respond the way they thought they were supposed to respond. They didn't respond like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the situation. They froze up. They went numb. They got confused. They were indecisive. They got impulsive and did the wrong thing, did stupid things. And then they live, here's these 20-year-old guys over there, put in this insane situation. They have to respond to it, and then they have to live with the memories of what they did for the rest of their lives. And they're often ashamed to tell anybody about it. They come back and they can't talk about this to their wife, to their girlfriend. They can't tell their children about it. And so they have great difficulty ever processing it psychologically. And so these are this is the source of some of these symptoms, like an intrusion of memories and avoidance of emotional connectedness and this hyper-arousal of intense, exaggerated emotions. And there are actual physical brain changes that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And these brain changes have only been identified in veterans who actually experienced combat directly. And then there are these other related disorders that are not post-traumatic stress: depression, suicide, panic disorders, phobic, substance abuse, divorces, all kinds of social and personal and marital and family dysfunctions. And so when they ask guys coming back from Vietnam or from Iraq, do you want to get some treatment for this? You can see that most of them don't disagree that treatment would be a good thing. They actually believe in treatment. 75% of them actually believe in the effectiveness of treatment. But they're afraid it's going to hurt their careers. They're afraid of peer rejection. Now, the efforts to deal with PTSD really depend on not avoiding it, but going back to relive in some controlled and supportive environment the actual events that were traumatic. And people just do this naturally. Anna Freud discovered this in bombing children who had been exposed to these London bombings in World War II. And as a child therapist, I always found that to be true. Kids go back and they replay traumatic events in their play and symbolically, and through drawings and through paintings and so forth. So the natural thing is to go back. And this is what all those intrusive memories and dreams or things are about. They're trying to take you back to relive in some transformed way the experiences that were traumatic. Now, one of the effects of war is to actually on society is to widen the schisms that already exist. And one of the most important schisms in our culture and most other cultures is this thing called liberals and conservatives. There really is a psychological difference between liberals and conservatives. And it goes back to early family relationships. And when it comes to processing collective guilt, which is what we at least unconsciously are all dealing with now as American citizens, we are collectively guilty for the murder of probably close to 1 million Iraqi citizens. It's absolutely incomprehensible to think in those terms. And so people just avoid it primarily, but it's still there. It's a truth. It's just like in family therapy. There is a truth within a family that has been hidden. And conservatives tend to process this kind of internal stress by blaming the victim. So if we killed all these Vietnamese people, they had it coming. These Iraqis are all terrorists. They're all insurgents. They're just a bunch of animals. They're killing each other. Sunnis, Shias, they're all killing each other. We're just there trying to help. And that's the American word. We're always trying to help. In Lebanon, 20 years after the Marine barracks were blown out, the survivors that still don't even know why it was done. They had no idea that we were actually siding with Israel in their attack on Lebanon, which infuriated the Arab world, and that's why our Marine barracks were blown up. They still think they were there to bring freedom and law and order to these unruly people in Lebanon. See, that's the conservative world. We always blame the victim. Us liberals tend to blame our own government. We are the ones who question authority, and that is our bias. And I won't go into all of this right now, but this is what's called an egogram, and as you can see, there are one is kind of the typical conservative, and one is the typical liberal, and we have very, very different personality structures. The top boxes are the conscience, the so-called the internalized parent. You've all heard of the inner child. Those are the two bottom boxes. The adult is the logical, rational thinking, and pure self. As a result of our childhood conditioning, our childhood family relationships, we become very, very different. And so we process adult experiences at both the personal and the social level very differently. So we have the survivors, and we have the person who has done the killing. At some point in his life, he's going to realize that person he killed was not a gook, it was not a haji, it was a man like him, who went to soccer and went and studied his homework and learned a foreign language and had a girlfriend and so forth. And he's going to have that insight that Walt Whitman is describing there. And then he's going to have to deal with that. So after World War I, the planet was fed up with war. They said, hey, we can't be doing this crazy stuff anymore. And in 1928, there was the Paris Peace Conference, which outlawed aggressive war. It is illegal under international law to attack another country, period. Nazis were tried and executed at Nuremberg for that. Japanese leaders were tried and executed at Tokyo for that, for the waging of war. It was called crimes against peace. That remains international law. And international law, the treaty, is defined by treaties, and all treaties that we have signed are the supreme law of our land under Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the United States Constitution. So by violating international laws, we are also violating our own Constitution. And much of my presentations on impeachment is based on this. This was a statement by the Nuremberg Tribunal, incorporated into the Nuremberg Charter, to which the United States is a signatory. The thinking of the world was that if nobody starts wars, we won't have wars. It is legal under international law to defend yourself when you are attacked. So the Iraqis are on perfectly legal ground to defend themselves. The Palestinians are on completely legal ground defending themselves against Israel. It is the aggressor who is always in violation of international law. And the opportunity I see in this, we have been doing this for a long time. And the Bush administration is so flagrant that it brings to light the things we've been doing for a long time, and we actually have an opportunity to reshape our vision of ourselves as a nation and the kind of nation we're going to be. And here's a little chronology And I have handouts here for you, so if anybody want to, read all this text. These are some of the things we've done since World War II. Overthrown leaders, orchestrated coups, conducted assassinations, replaced governments, installed dictators that American businesses can work with. And this is only a partial list. So getting back to this idea of peace, I mean, this is not just some pipe dream. You know, from 1928 on, it has been the will of mankind. That's why aggressive war was made illegal. And if our nation, for example, had not exercised 40 vetoes of resolutions against Israel, they would have to stop doing what they're doing. And if our citizens would take charge of our own country, since Congress won't do it, our own leaders right now should not only be impeached, they should be indicted as war criminals. They should be indicted and tried here for treason, and they should then be extradited to The Hague to stand trial as war criminals. And that's why impeachment is so important. It's not a matter of practicality. That doesn't matter. I mean, if we are going to be a nation under the rule of law, we better take that seriously and apply these laws to our own leaders to achieve or restore any integrity for our country and any respect in the eyes of the world. Our own leaders, when they commit crimes of this magnitude, need to be subjected to the judgment of law. And this then would be the start of reformulating who we are as a nation. Are we going to be, as a nation, representing 5% of the world's population, are we going to be a citizen of the world? Or are we going to be this arrogant, murderous nation that simply goes around behaving as an international outlaw above all the rest of mankind and indifferent to the laws of the world? I mean, we citizens have to make that decision. So that, to me, is the great challenge. And you start with sensitizing people to the realities of what we're doing and making them aware of our history, taking them back to the Indian Wars, taking them back to the Mexican-American. I use the immigration issue to bring up, well, you know, if President Polk hadn't picked a fight with Mexico, just like the Gulf of Tonkin, it was a completely phony excuse for going over to Mexico so that he could grab the western United States. You know, we'd be speaking Spanish in, you know, California, Arizona, and all the way to Colorado. Maybe not here, because it's probably belonged to Russia, I recall. We need to make our nation aware, and our nation needs to make a decision. So that's what I work on. I work on this concept of awareness of all these things. All these slides can be used in any, you know, combination or any part of them for any purpose, for counter-recruitment or anything. So if any of you would like to call upon any part of my PowerPoints, I'd be glad to share them with you.
Is there an easy way to contact you?
Well, yeah. I'll put some of my cards somewhere. There's a table. And this is our website, and you can contact me directly, or you can look at a lot of the writings on this website.
The strangest dream I'd ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end